each time, but I will send it out again each week so you don't have to find it in your inbox. All right. Many of you know Judy. She is a former curator of the Lee Mansion. She runs her own Marblehead architectural history firm and consultancy. She offers walking tours. She is an amazing source of knowledge about Marblehead, social, cultural history, decorative arts, architecture. So we are thrilled to welcome her. And Judy, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you for that praise. That sounds very official. I'm just sort of me doing architecture things, but lots of social history too. And that's what you'll get today through this course, probably more today than the rest of the course, is a lot of social history, because architecture just doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think social history is so important, but it also makes it interesting. So thank you so much to all of you for taking this 2-hour chunk of your week 4 times and joining this. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoy it. I always learn things too, one way or the other. I learned a few things when I was preparing this as well. So that's the joy of living in a really interesting place, is that you're constantly learning. So this is a great aerial view of so many houses in Marblehead and this harbor that we all love so much. But this course will talk mostly about the buildings and how the town developed, some architecture terms, etc., some social history, some family history. But when we get to the questions, please let me know kind of if there's some other kinds of things you do want to hear. I will be talking much more about architecture in the next 3 weeks, less about architecture in this session, because I really feel it's important to give a little bit of background about Marblehead and the town itself and what it was and how it developed. So that's what we're really going to be doing today, kind of half of that preparation for the course, and then half this very mysterious 1600s. And I do some walking tours. I live across the street from Betty Hunt, and she is awesome. And I've learned from her for years and years. I started at the Lee Mansion in 1993 when she retired, and I loved working there for 16 years. And I still learn from her and hang out. And in fact, she was my mom in my wedding when I got married out in Gas House Beach. So it's been fun to learn and experience Marblehead through her and through everything else. So thank you again, and let's get started. So this is Marblehead looking out at this beautiful harbor. And if you look down to the very end under the frost fish where it says Marblehead, just right under the head, you can see 2 little islands way out there. That's the little harbor, and I'll be showing you some maps and so forth, but that's where the town started, and that's where it developed. And it pretty much developed down the big harbor in the 1700s. There were scattered houses in the downtown area, and that what we're looking at right now is the downtown area. But the development kind of went along from the little harbor, Orange Street backwards. You drive down Orange Street backwards or walk, and then Washington Street, as you see it coming around here, and then to pretty much where the Boston Yacht Club is. There were loads of wharfs there because there was a cove there. So Washington Street really is the obvious line of development as the town moved forward in the 1700s. Okay. And we experimented with advancing, but it's not advancing. Oh dear. Do you have a suggestion?
Is the forward or reverse arrows? You can also see where, yep, there you go.
Okay. So I'm delighted to do this for the Historical Society. And if some of you are new, forgive me for repeating some things, but that is the Historical Society building, a little 20th century building, but that means it's much more functional in some ways. You know, it's hard to live downtown, and I'm still having trouble with this. So we'll see how it goes. So today we'll be focusing most thoroughly on what's most unique and special about Marblehead's architecture heritage. And that's the hundreds of houses built well before the revolution began in 1775. I'll talk about 18th and 19th century also 19th century also, but mostly these special houses. And this is the time when England and the North American colonies were still English. Marblehead's historic district has one of the, the protected part of its historic district has one of the largest numbers of colonial houses predating the American Revolution, and one of the highest concentrations, comprising a space of land approximately just a mile long by about a quarter of a mile deep. And you all know that is basically precinct 1 and a little bit of precinct 2. And in the 1700s, this was very much an urban community, just like it is today. And there are examples of all kinds of architectural styles all around the historic district. But the unique part is some of the older ones. I'm going to try and get rid of my faces too here. Let's see if I can do that. We're all getting used to this. Let me see if I skipped one. 13 buildings are individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So these are some of them: the Townhouse, the King Hooper Mansion, the Jeremiah Lee Mansion, the Elbridge Gerry House in the lower corner, and the John Glover House. One in the lower left, you might not know about. It's a little bit out of town. It's the Commodore Samuel Tucker House, and it should be listed if it's not, but it doesn't seem to be. He was quite a guy and quite a header, a rebel patriot, a Commodore of the Navy, a Revolutionary War captain before that, and a privateer hero. He brought John Adams to France in 1778 and escaped from prison several times from privateer vessels when he was in prison. Retired to Maine after the Revolution, and then when the War of 1812 broke out 30 years later, he came back and served in that when he was in his 60s, and was captured then and imprisoned and escaped. And he's an interesting guy, but very few people know about his house down there. It's in the lower left. But in Marblehead, as in Newport, Rhode Island, and Annapolis, Maryland, and Charleston, South Carolina, and unlike in most other historic early American towns, here we have entire streetscapes of colonial houses that we can see and enjoy. And you really have the feeling of being in the past here. All three of those towns that I mentioned, you have that also, but Marblehead has so many 18th century houses. And that's a legacy that once the exteriors are modified and modernized, that can't be recovered, or the interiors either for that matter, but there's no regulation over interiors. So a lot of these buildings, as in Europe these days, some of them are just shells and the historic fabric is gone. But at least as you're walking through the town, this is a really unique town where you can experience the past so much better than other places. So we're fortunate that the Olden Historic District Commission was established in the 1970s. There were a couple of different phases of that, 1968, 1976. That's a regulatory board that keeps the modifications from getting out of hand. They can be sensitive, and certainly modifications have occurred all over time. If you were on a walking tour or looking at these pictures, the dormer windows in the blue house were added in the 20th century, so were the ones up in the little greenhouse in the middle. Almost all the dormer windows in Marblehead are more recent than not. But then again, that third house back, that greenhouse, that was completely remodeled in the 1830s or 50s. And that happened constantly in Marblehead, and you can see that quite a lot. The little pink house used to be the size of the yellow house, but the pink house enlarged after the Revolution to add a third floor, and the yellow house added what they call a shed dormer window. So those things happen over time, but it's nice to have. I mean, the town would disappear in its historic character if we didn't have the regulatory board. So you kind of have to buy into that if you live in the historic district. It's sometimes not easy, as you know. But that regulatory board is separate and distinct, if some of you are new, from the Marblehead Historical Commission, which collects historic artifacts and now advocates for architecture as well. And they're doing some surveys of the entire town, which is great. They're all online. There are going to be 14 of them, I think. They're on the second or third. They did an overall survey already. But they also collect a lot of documents, as does the Marblehead Historical Society, now the Marblehead Museum since 2003. So it's great that we have that much historical interest. Otherwise, we would just look like any place else and all kinds of modern buildings would go up. And that's great, but this is so unique, and that's why it's special. That said, unlike Newport, Rhode Island, or Annapolis, Maryland, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Glastonbury, Connecticut, those are kind of the towns that have concentrations of historic architecture. These are all in Newport. And Ipswich, Massachusetts, which has 59 houses built before 1725. I have the wrong number on there to 1725, more than any other town in the US. Except I think Marblehead could give it a run for their money. Especially when you count the 17 teens. So I think let me roll that tape back. I think that is the correct number, 59 before 1700. Marblehead has loads, dozens and dozens, maybe even 100 from the 17 teens, which is really unique. So these towns, though, and that's the Whipple House in Ipswich as well, which is a wonderful representation of an older house. It was modernized at some point in the 18 or 1900s. Then it was brought back in the early 20th century because so much of its interior does survive. That's one place I recommend to go to see a 17th century interior. They've been run by the Ipswich Museum since 1899. Marblehead does not have an official historic house registry or preservation program. When I moved to Marblehead because of the architecture from Los Angeles. Big change. But I moved here because of the abundance of architecture. You can really be steeped in the architecture. But I was surprised that there was no official registry or preservation agency as far as advocacy and so forth. So what we have is these wonderful white signs on so many of the buildings that really give evidence that these are old houses to visitors or residents. If you were to look at this house that's from 1670, you would never dream that that was a 1670s house. So the signs really make a big difference to give visitors and residents a sense of the ambiance. These are some other signs that are in Marblehead. This is the Samuel Tucker House, which does have a plaque, even though it's not on the National Register, the one I was talking about before. The DAR put that up in 1928. The Colonel Jeremiah Lee Mansion was 1963 as a National Historic Landmark. And the Townhouse was a National Historic Landmark established in 1976. And that was mobilized by grassroots efforts as well as a national effort. The Daughters of the American Revolution also put up 2 years before or 5 years before the Samuel Tucker chapter, they put up the plaque on the John Glover House on Glover Square near the town landing. And the Sons of the American Revolution put up the plaque on the Elbridge Gerry House. But every house, not just these fancy or important people, houses of important people, not just the fancy houses or the houses of important people, every house really has a story, and that is harder to find. So these signs really tell us about the fabric of our community just by having not only the date that says this is an old house, but the professions. And note on some of these signs, you have built for, built for, built for. So many books say Jeremiah Lee built his mansion. Well, of course, he didn't build the mansion. Loads of house wrights and Finnish carpenters built that mansion. But there were joiners in town and house wrights, and Isaac Mansfield was one. So here we have a built by Isaac Mansfield joiner. That was his house, actually, in that one. So these mostly informative signs, these white ones, have been researched by Marblehead historian Robert Booth, and he's been doing that for a half a century, since 1976. That's the nation's bicentennial, of course, and we're coming up now to the 250th in just 4 years. So his reports have an entire researched history behind them, not just a series of dates when, who owned the house, but he gives you a biography of the house, basically, of the house owners as much as he knows. And because he's been researching so long, he knows a lot of that. everybody can bark up the wrong tree sometimes, but he has a better sense of being able to tell one not Martin from another not Martin. And there's so many different repetitive names. He was raised in Marblehead and went to Harvard, and then was in the American Studies program at Boston University in architectural history. So that's his contact information. If your friends would like to have their house researched, the museum does it also, I think. That's kind of a new service. And I recommend either one, but I think Bob gives you a very thorough story as much as you can for the house. And that's his contact information on the screen there. And so he's got lots of probate inventories on microfilm that he's printed out. It just is a much easier process. I mentioned the joiners earlier. Maybe I should have put that slide earlier. This is one of the leading joiners in town, who was very much a part of Marblehead's development in that early 1700s. So again, built by Samuel Goodwin, as opposed to built for. That's a very high style house for 1723 with those dormer windows, very academically informed. And this was sort of like a business card for this joiner. This is on Pearl Street, right across from the Harbor Light Inn. But he was saying, I'm here from Boston. I'm ready to work. This is what I can do. And he actually came to build a church and stayed. And there were lots of Goodwins who followed him. It's a very complex family, and they're hard to track on the deeds also, because there are so many names that are the same, but there are many families like that. So here's built for Samuel Goodwin, the joiner. His house was across the street. This is the Harbor Light Inn. But if you can see the doorway and the two windows next to it, and the three windows above those, that was the 1729 house. Then it was enlarged for Dr. Calvin Briggs in a very difficult economic year. 1819 was the year of an economic panic in the nation. It's a very steep economic crash. Right after the winter of the great snow of 1817, after the year of no winter, the year without a summer was 1816. That was the end of the War of 1812, ended in 1815, had been going on for 3 years. So it was a really tough time in Marblehead. And yet there are a few people, there's always some people who are making some money, and enlarged this very small 1-over-1 room house, maybe two behind those rooms, and made this very large 3-story house that's now the Harbor Light Inn. That happened countless times in all seasons in Marblehead, where you would have a small house and enlarge it. That's probably what happened here. This is a sign that is not a Bob Booth sign, but it's a sign that somebody looked into their house. And that 3-story house is certainly not 1699. And that doorway portico is not 1699 either. So you have to be very careful at looking at the house, looking at the documents, and trying to figure out who's who and what's what. So it's always good to hire somebody. I even hired him to do my house, and I probably could do it myself, but I wasn't going to trust myself to do it as smoothly. So this is the Captain Samuel Russell Trevitt house, much higher style, a very high style house for 1715, I should say. And this is his portrait. Wow, Russell Trevitt, the father and grandfather from the 1730s or 50s. It's very seldom that you will ever know who these people were that lived in your house. This is one of the few portraits in Marblehead from the 18th century, other than the Copley portraits. But what a handsome guy this is, and what a beautiful painting, beautiful portrait, probably by Joseph Badger. And it's on display in the Lee Mansion. So if you haven't seen it, go see it. But on this house, there's a Bob Booth history for this house, but there's a sign with a whale on it. A lot of the signs you saw had cods, of course. Well, a handful have whales, and I'm sure Benjamin and Russell Trevitt both would be rolling over in their grave, because they were cod fishermen. I mean, they were cod merchants, codfish merchants. And this town is a cod town, not a whaling town. But as I said, I was happy to have somebody research my house and not try it myself. And I would not probably have learned that John actually, for whom the house was built, moved up to Ganso 10 years later with his wife in the back and beyond to manage the fishing operations for his Trevitt family dynasty. He's the younger brother. So it was lovely to learn that. And now I've actually been in touch with Parks Canada about John Trevitt up there because he's on their website. He's quite a murky character. Very few people know about any of these people and who they were, but some of the stories are compelling. And I proudly fly the Loyalist flag, I'll have to admit. I would have been a Loyalist. I don't, this is a dicey comment now, but I don't want to, overthrow governments. I would not have wanted to be a rebel patriot back then. I am a very obedient person. So I am one of the few loyalists in town, I think, in Marblehead. I think Marblehead was, from what I can tell, was about 90% rebel patriot back in the day. And there are a lot of good reasons for that in 1775, which we don't have time to go into here. But so again, this is not an official program, but it's a very valuable one. And it's really cool to draw the connections between Gary's and everybody else. Here's a third, those two were both Gary houses. Here's a third, there's a warehouse on Front Street as well. But this is the famous Gary house, Elbridge Gary house, and we certainly know it as his house. Below that portrait of him by John Vanderlyn is his house where he lived in Cambridge. So it's a very nice 3-story house. But the Gary house on Washington Street, right across from the Old North Church, that did not look like that in 1744. It would not have been a 3-story house that early. And Elbridge Gary, this was his birthplace. So this house site is apparently where he grew up. And maybe he lived there, but he had 4 brothers. Well, let me back up before I get to that. The house probably looked like one of these two in the 1740s, either a pitched roof with a peak at the top, or a gambrel roof, as they call it, with a notch, which gives you more space, as you can see it pretty clearly there, more space in the 3rd floor. That's probably what the Gary house looked like in 1744. And he was not the only child who was born there. There were 5 children born there. Actually, 11 children were born. 5 survived infancy and youth. That was Elbridge and his 3 brothers and 1 sister. So he had 2 older brothers, 1 younger brother. His father and his brothers, 2 of his brothers were in the Revolution. So I don't know if Gary's father lived in the smaller house, the pinkish color one on Front Street, that was probably enlarged to a 3rd floor after the Revolution. I suspect that too had a peaked roof or a gambrel roof. So were the boys, the older boys, were they born here and then they moved to the other house? We don't know that because that house has never had a history researched. And if any house should have one, that should have one. There's some information in the from when it became a National Historic Landmark. So it bears looking into further. But you also need to look at the structure to understand these houses. But here's a cool thing. This is one of the Gary boys. This was John Gary, Elbridge's older brother, the middle brother of the 3 or the 4. And what an awesome portrait that is. So that family was a very, very prominent family. Thomas Gary owned Gary's Island. It's not Elbridge Gary's Island, it's his father, Thomas Gary's Island. It's a very important family that we really don't know much about. We only know about Elbridge. So here's this great portrait that is actually at Bayou Bend in Houston, Texas, of one of the sons, age 4. Was there a portrait of Elbridge too, or the oldest son? We don't know. All 3 sons got married, or all 4 sons rather got married. 3 had 3 children. Elbridge had 10. Who knew? And this is his wife. I just met her recently. I had not been very familiar with the family, and saw this beautiful portrait, and she was from New York City, and she was apparently supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the United States. She was 20 years younger than Elbridge. They met in New York City when he was in the Continental Constitution Convention, because the Congress met in New York City at that time. They got married in 1786. They had 10 children, 7 of them lived. He died in 1814 when he was vice president, and she died 25 years later, pretty much in poverty. They had this nice house in Cambridge when they lived in Massachusetts, and when he was in Washington, D.C. He just rented rooms, but he died in Washington, D.C. And she went back to New York and had a pretty hard financial time. But he bought that house at a bargain sale. So yeah, it was a loyalist home. And so it was not a huge stretch, but it was a beautiful house. So there are all these great Gary stories that we know through house histories. And I'm going to skip over this one. It has to do with Fort Sewell, that a granddaughter of Thomas Gary lived in the Yellow House, which she apparently married. I am going to go into it real briefly. A commander during the War of 1812, a commander came to serve at Fort Sewell, and they got married in 1813. So she must have met him somehow. They hit it off, and they ended up living in this house. So that's kind of a fun story. And they had 2 children. One died at age 6. So at any rate, there's a lot behind these signs. And I, for one, think it's really interesting. Physical investigation really ideally should go hand in hand with the documents and the deed search. This is a house that was built in 1694. If you were to go into it now, you wouldn't see anything from 1694, of course. It was completely remodeled in the late 1970s when so many houses were starting to be remodeled in Marblehead. And that's why Bob Booth started researching, doing those house histories back in 1976. So you can see that peaked roof on the upper left. That's the 17th century, the 1600s profile of the steeply pitched roofs, which we'll talk about in more detail later on in the class today. And then an addition to the right was added sometime in the 1830s or 50s, and probably had another early 1900s remodeling and certainly a 1970s remodeling. So it's a 2-family house right now. And Bob was able to go in there and see some of the material before it left. See some of the building structure, which was good. So he learned a lot about that. So the key points that we're going to take away through this social history is really kind of why streets and and houses look the way they do here, and some special aspects of some Marblehead homes and buildings. This one in particular, and happy winter to you all. This one in particular is a very, very important house. I have a mental list of about, it's written down too, but I have about 10 houses that are the most important houses in Marblehead. And this is one of them, and it nudges down toward number 5, actually, because under those icicles, there is a curve that you can't see because it was painted brown, but it's a curve of lath and plaster. And I encourage you to take a walk sometime for your COVID exercise and getting out of the house, and go up to the base of Burial Hill and look at that eave, the eave line. And I'm going to show you a couple of houses that look similar to it. These are other houses that have what they call coved cornices, C-O-V-E. You can have a coved cornice inside or at this time outside. And it was only right about at the turn of the 1700s that they did this. And that's basically lath and plaster in a cove shape running linear down the face of the house. So you can imagine how fragile it is. So they disappear. And about 6 houses in New England have them. And that's one of them here in Marblehead. The ones that I'm showing you now, there's one in Gloucester, one in Ipswich, one in Lexington, one in Newburyport, 2 in Newburyport, excuse me. And I think there were 1 or 2 others, but that's not very many. So it's very fragile. You can see these center chimneys in these early houses. They're all from the late 1600s, early 1700s, still called what they refer to as first period. And I think in my mucking up with the slides, I think I missed my slide that defined the periods of time with a nice visual. So I'll introduce that again next week. But the first period of architecture is pretty much from 1629 in Marblehead, or the 1620s or 30s, depending on where you are here in New England, up until about 1720s. So it's about 100 years. And then you have the Georgian style, which is so called because the Kings George were on the throne through most of that time from the 1720s onward into 1820 and beyond, actually, up to Queen Victoria in 1837. So the Georgian period in England is a long one. We call it the Georgian period here. We don't call it the Georgian period here very much. We call it the colonial period because that style sort of ended with the Revolution. But I'll show you the visual when we get to it. This is another example, again, of how many houses are modified over time. There's that one that I mentioned earlier, which would have started out as a one room over one room. And then after the Revolution, they added a third floor. And then sometime in the 1850s, they added two over two windows, or actually two over one in this case. Maybe around the Revolution, they added that doorway portico, which is that framework around the door with a triangle at the top. That's called a portico. But maybe that was added in the 1960s. We don't know. So the colonial revival period was very active in certain time periods, not so much in Marblehead in the 1870s, but certainly in the 1960s and 70s it was. So that house is kind of an eclectic mix, as many of them are. The one on the right is down near Old North Church and Bartlett's Garage. It too was a one room over one room with the roof line running parallel to the street right over those second floor windows like you've seen before. But in the 1850s, they rotated the roof 90 degrees and added a nice comfortable third floor in the new styles. And the doorway entrance would have been where those shutters are down below. And those shutters are actually not even a window. That's just a wall in that room, but that's where the doorway would have been. So you can see the early houses lurking in some of these remodeled houses. We call the framework sort of the bones of the houses are still there. And Marblehead has at least 300 houses built before the Revolution, which is really remarkable. So that's, as I started this course saying that the social history is important. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, here's my slide where I was talking about the periods. One of the takeaways at the end of this course, I hope that you'll be able to identify the major defining elements of each of the main architectural periods and styles. And into the 1800s, there are basically four styles. First period I mentioned, with these steeply pitched roofs, usually one over one room houses. The Georgian or colonial period was pretty much in the 1720s, which is when the first King George got onto the throne, to the 1780s. He actually came onto the throne in 1714. That's a big year for Marblehead. We'll get into that later. And he died the year the townhouse was built. And then King George II reigned after that. And King George III was the king during the Revolution, and he lived until 1820. But we call this in America, we usually call it colonial. So in the lower left is the federal style or neoclassical style. Georgian architecture is really a classical style. We'll talk more about that one next week when we talk about the 1700s. But the Georgian style has elements of architecture from Greece and Rome, looking back at the classical world. And then in England and elsewhere, a new version of classical replaced the older pedantic one. The older classical was horizontal and heavier and three-dimensional. The new classical was taller and more slender and attenuated, whether it was a building or furniture or clothing or bodies. So you have these clean, flat lines in the lower left, and you saw more architecture construction out of brick, especially in the South. They've been building in brick all along, but especially in New England, the brick really started being used after the Revolution, because before the Revolution, everybody was pretty much heating their bodies with fireplaces. You can heat a room, but you can't heat the house with a fireplace. You can close up the room, you can get close to the fireplace, you can heat your bodies, but they did not want to build with brick houses because the damp is so cold in Marblehead. The cold is so damp, rather, in New England, that they were afraid of contracting lung diseases. And so until iron stoves started being used for heating, brick was not usually used as construction material here for a house. So you see that transition. We'll talk more about that next week. But then after the federal style, this neoclassical style in England, we call federal here in America, just like we called the Georgian style colonial. Federal is the name, is a word that means centralized. We had a new federal government after the Revolution and after the Constitution, after the 1780s, and that federal government was a centralized government. So that's what the term federal refers to, and so the architecture got that term as well. After that, there's a reaction back to a little more three-dimensionality. The triangles come back, and heavier forms, heavier paneling, heavier trim. And that's referred to as Greek revival because they were really trying to emulate the architecture of Greece and Rome in the body of the house, not just the details. So you have a little mini Greek temple there on the lower right without the pillars, the freestanding pillars in the front. If you lived in an antebellum Southern mansion, you would probably have the pillars in the front. So that's the Greek revival style, which pretty much thrived in the 1820s to 50s. And then it morphed a little, and we'll talk about that in the third week. So I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself there. There are not nearly as many homes from right after the Revolution, like this big, very fancy one that just actually sold up in Washington Square across from Abbott Hall, or like the Harbor Light Inn. Marblehead was having a very difficult economic time after the Revolution. It was hard to recover. That's a longer story than I really have time to go into now. But on a walking tour, we could go into that, and I'll touch on it later on too. But suffice it to say, with the Revolution and then trading in the Atlantic, which was a war zone at that time between England and France and their navies, all through the 1780s and then the 90s and then the Napoleonic Wars, the Atlantic is where Marblehead had fished and traded. We did not go to the Pacific like Salem did as much. A few did, but not many. So we don't have as many of these big federal houses as Salem does, but we have loads of colonial houses from before the Revolution. So the schedule pretty much will be this week, we'll kind of take ourselves into the 1700s, but we'll focus on the context and on the 1600s. Next week, we'll talk about the 1700s up to the Revolution. The third week, we'll talk about from the Revolution to the centennial, actually, the 19th century. And then the last week, we'll start into the turn of the century after the nation's centennial, which is 1876. Up to the bicentennial in 1976. And if anybody knows the artist of this image, I'd love to know. So somebody can put it in the chat if they know. It's a lovely woodblock print. And there's a 20th century artist who was one of the founders of the Arts Association who did woodblock print. So it might be him, but it might not. So this is a little verbal snapshot of Marblehead's history, just so you kind of have it in front of you. Any of you who want to take a screenshot or something, you're welcome to do that. 1629 to 1713, this town was barely a town. It was a very rough fishing settlement, not very sparsely settled, but it became a boom town in the 17 teens. And for a century, it was a truly boisterous Atlantic seaport. Albeit distressed economically, as I said, from 1775 to the 1820s, sporadic. Not everybody at every given time, but on the whole, it was in very rough shape compared to Salem, which was almost like its own country, very prosperous. So colonial era were very gritty, but prosperous up until the Revolution. And then 1830, we finally start to have a broader measure of recovery for the town. And Marblehead was a satellite town in the shoemaking industry, which was based pretty much in Lynn as the hub. Salem, Peabody did tanning. Everybody kind of had a piece of that. But so Marblehead was a little bit of a satellite town. But we did have a lot of shoe factories, as you know, as many people know. They were mostly wood. They were mostly small, 3 stories, maybe 4, mostly 3. And then a big fire in 1877, they rebuilt in brick, then another big fire in 1888. And then that was about when we were transitioning to a seaside summer resort anyway. So the first Yacht Club was established in 1874. The first regatta, the first person to sail in a sailing regatta was 1845, actually. But as an economic thing, 1874 was the first yacht club. So after the Civil War, basically. And then that boom sort of crashed in World War I. And after 1940, after World War I, the Atlantic Avenue suburbs developed. And after 1945, the West Shore suburbs developed. That doesn't mean there wasn't some construction here and there in any of those places, but that's when the big move came. And now, of course, since the 1970s, this has been a very thriving residential and business community. The course will touch on interiors, but maybe we could explore that next year as a course if anybody's super interested in that, because we don't have time for everything now, but I'll touch on it. And in the 1600s, some of those interiors could be quite dynamic. Any kind of earth-based colors, they wanted it if they could, but most people couldn't. So the past was a very earth-toned place. Not a lot of color, unless you had money. More rooms might have looked along the lines of this in the earliest houses, the early houses in the 1600s. And there's your restroom, there's your heating system down there on the floor under the bed. Your toilet would have been under the bed also for overnight. Right now I'm showing it to the right. You might have a chair, you might have two chairs, you might more likely have stools, maybe some small benches. And that's about it. And you'd be very happy if you had kind of blankets for curtains to keep the drafts out. So very rudimentary for most people on their interiors. So using Isle Oren's wonderful photo after having seen that postcard, and then we'll see one by Rick Ashley as well. This was an introduction to to the course that I've just now talked about. And now I want to go to a little bit more historical context. So the other was more architectural. This is going to be a little bit about what Marblehead was and what was going on while all this architectural development that we have talked about and will talk about was happening. So the Lee Mansion, of course, one giant house, gorgeous, one of the most superlative houses in all of America. I hope you have all gone to see it and take a tour when we can do that again. It's of course closed in the winter because thank goodness it has never had heating or plumbing. So that has helped it stay intact so much better. But it truly is one of the most spectacular houses in all of colonial America of the late colonial period. And Marblehead was far different than what people thought. Far different than most people think it was. Most people think Marblehead was kind of a backwards fishing village and always was that. Well, it was in the 1600s, but not in the 1700s. In 1629, they were trying to get people to come to New England. And Reverend Francis Higginson was writing and in 1629 extolling this area. And that's the year Marblehead was settled. And part of what he wrote was, "Here is marble stone in such store that we have great rocks of it." We certainly did. "And a harbor hard by. Our plantation is from thence called Marble Harbor." Well, with the Down East accent, we would have been Marblehead for some people, so it's a good thing we're not. But what's a plantation? A plantation is simply basically a settlement of people. It doesn't mean a slave plantation. It doesn't mean overworked laborers, overworked and abused and inhumane. A plantation is a group of people settling. That's what it is up here. Now Rhode Island is wrestling with that term, as you all probably know, but that's what these settlements were called plantations. And this harbor is why Marblehead exists to begin with. It's why it reached the surprising economic level that it did in the 1700s to create that exceptional architectural legacy that we see now today. So this is the harbor from a different direction. And I'll be showing you a lot of the little harbor where those islands are on the right, because that was the harbor hard by that Higginson referenced. The big harbor, as most of you know, is wide open to storms. The little harbor was much more sheltered. So here's the geographical north-facing Google Maps map of Salem Harbor and Marblehead. which was one big peninsula sticking out into water. And Marblehead, as you know, was part of Salem to begin with until 1649. So the little harbor on the northeast corner is what the writer was describing. That was Marblehead Harbor. That's Marblehead Harbor in the 1600s. It was sheltered, there were coves. That's not to say there wasn't development around the whole peninsula, but it was more scattered. I love this map of Marblehead. If you haven't seen it, next time you go to Abbott Hall, go take a look at this map. This is Marblehead as painted in the WPA program, the Works Progress Administration, which was a government-supported back-to-work program that built so many bridges and roads and buildings and Adirondack hotels and Yosemite hotels and all the bridges in the national parks and Acadia and so forth. Well, I guess the Rockefellers did part of that road. But at any rate, the Works Progress Administration built so much infrastructure, but they also had an artist branch. And kind of late in the program, 34 and 35, is a couple of years into it, these murals, a whole suite of murals were painted in Abbott Hall, and they're fabulous, showing Marblehead history. And this is the map of Marblehead. And you see the buildings in the downtown section. Well, that was kind of really the border of the old downtown section. They're showing the highlights there in that map. But that was kind of the border as the town developed down that line to the left, as it were, on this map. The neck was devoid of houses, pretty much, maybe some warehouses, maybe some fish shacks, until pretty much the Civil War, after the Civil War. That's where the mural is, the COVID arrow there to go out. So stop by and look at it sometime. We've got the sailing to the left of it and the flying cloud to the right of it on that wall. So another one, John Jocelyn was writing in 1671, a little, quite a bit later. To the northward of Lynn is Marblehead or Marblehead, a small harbor. So we're still that little harbor, the shore rocky upon which the town is built, consisting of a few scattered houses. William Wood, back in 1633, in New England's Prospect, wrote about Marblehead again, which lieth 4 miles full south from Salem. And I love this phrase, here be good harbor for boats and safe riding for ships. So again, he's talking about that little harbor that you see from a 1909 map there. But the little harbor is illustrated quite nicely. So you see Dolliver's Cove there up at the top, and the little harbor down toward the bottom, just north of Gales Head, which we know as Fort Sewell. And you can see the gas works there to the right of the words Little Harbor. That's where the gas coal was delivered there in the late 1800s and converted to gas for gas lighting in the streets and in homes. And that's now kind of a park. And there's a close-up of it a little bit more. Fountain Park. If you heard my fort talk, we talked about the fort and how it reached over, and Fountain Park was always a fortified area because Little Harbor was a very vulnerable spot where Marblehead could have been invaded by an army, an invading enemy army. So that's where they could have landed longboats and invaded the town. And you think it was just a poor little fishing village, why would they want to do it? But that's the point. Marblehead was fairly strategic, especially economically because of the fishing, and then as a thriving community in the 1700s. Marblehead in the 1600s built the codfish aristocracy of Salem and Boston. So again, Josiah Cotton, next time I do this, I'll rearrange those two quotes, writes, it has a very good harbor and the whole township is not much bigger than a large farm and very rocky, so they are forced to get their living from the sea. It's a very convenient place for a plantation, especially for such as will set upon the trade of fishing. So that was pretty idyllic, but fishing is what built Marblehead. And this is an image of a guy who could have lived here in the 1600s. He's a European, but this is what the folk would have looked like who lived here. And I like to think of this guy as Isaac Allerton, who was really one of the founders of our business of fishing here. He came up from Plymouth. He was actually warned out of Plymouth. He'd been the deputy governor and was the business guy, but nobody's really sure what went south, whether it was embezzlement or using some of the company ships for his own use or what. But he came to Marblehead and started the fishing operation up here. And that was about 1635. He was a businessman. And then he was warned out of Marblehead. So that was really hard to do, to have happen. And he left all of his business accoutrements to his son-in-law, Moses Maverick. And Moses Maverick, we could do a whole hour on him, the guy nobody knows about. I did give it a whole hour for the Marblehead Historical Commission back in 2011. It was his 400th birthday, and he is our town founder. He was awesome. And Virginia Gamage did a dedication to him some years ago, but it's downtown, and the downtown wasn't there yet. The little harbor was Moses Maverick's hood. This is where he lived. So I hope we can honor him somehow, sometime. So we'll work on that. But anyway, they were talking, William Wood was writing, there was made here a ship's loading of fish last year where stands the stages and drying scaffolds. So there you see drying scaffolds of fish drying. This illustrates Newfoundland and Nova Scotia where the seasonal fishing started, but it would have been a similar type of situation down here. And here are some 20th century fish drying racks up in Newfoundland. And you can see how they tilt some of those toward the sun. And up at the top, those are fish flanks, basically, as they dried, but they were really big back in the old days. And there's J.O.J. Frost's model, the Marblehead Museum's model of a fish flake or a fish stage or a fish rack, and the fish flakes. So they have stages for fishermen. So there's a fish fence or a fish rack in the early 20th century up in Canada. And then to the right, Marblehead in the 1800s. But again, it would not have been much different than the 1600s and 1700s of fish drying. And oh my gosh, those racks would have covered every available spot, every rocky spot where a house was not. You would have fish drying racks. And the fish drying racks were more important than the houses, of course. So those are some scenes of the drying. And that's one of that little cove where I mentioned earlier that when we first started, that there was a little bit of an indentation in the harbor. Otherwise, that harbor is wide open to the storms. Now that's kind of where the Boston Yacht Club area is. It's been since filled in. It was called Next Cove. But here's a painting of fishing stages as well, and a pretty fine house there up on the hill of the merchant, and then the workers working the stages. And that's an overmantel painting at the Peabody Essex Museum. But William Wood also writes about orchards and gardens and good pastures and arable land. I think he's trying to market. But there were farms, market the community for settlement. There were farms, though, pretty much around the West Shore and in the middle of the peninsula. The rocky headlands were used for the fish drying, and there were large farm tracts, which I don't really have time to go into either, but it was kind of in the middle of the community of the peninsula, and then on the West Shore. Some of those properties were farms, and some of them were not. Most of them were not, but there were only just 50 house lots in the year 1700. So this is a map of Marblehead as the house lots looked in 1700, all around the perimeter of the peninsula. The fishing that we did was in the 1600s that Marbleheaders did was pretty much offshore. First, they started with those very close in banks, the Middle Bank, Jeffreys Bank. Those were easy to get to on a day trip or a couple of days. But then those got fished out, so they went out farther to George's Bank and Brown's Bank and some of the others. And of course, Nova Scotia had always been fishing, the Western Bank there. This is where the English fished all through the 1600s. We're not up at the Grand Bank yet. This is what they fished in a shallop, which is from the French word chaloupe. The French were the big fishermen. France is a Catholic country. They dominated the Grand Bank, and it was guarded by corsairs, pirates. So the English were doing just fine on those inshore banks until they got fished out. But the shallops were good for the inshore, close to shore fishing. and the overnight or a couple of day trips or just the day trips. Then they went to schooners once the 1700s really got rolling, and they had to go farther afield for the fish. And that was a problem because, as I said, the French dominated. But also in the Gulf of Maine there, where the banks are, there's this there was great danger because the Native Americans were allied with the French who occupied a lot of Canada, or most of Canada. The English had some of the coastline, but the French and the English were almost always at war, off and on, off and on, off and on, rolling war, basically, kind of every 10 years. And the French would ally with the Native Americans, and the Native Americans would sail out, row out in their canoes, basically, even for the early fishing. So fishing was a very dangerous prospect for a long time, from the beginning straight through to the end. So here's a schooner, a beautiful schooner painting in a private collection. And those are the ships that went out to the Grand Bank. So there you see the inshore banks, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Grand Bank of Newfoundland. Those are the shallows where the fish feed. And this is a schooner. This is fishing off of a schooner. They're not fishing with nets. They're fishing with hand lines right over the rails of the ship, pitching in the waves. And you can imagine how many people fell overboard. OSHA standards are not in practice. Nobody is roped in for the most part. They're climbing on rigging in those kinds of waves, and they're fishing with lines that are like a mile long and really big fish. So it's very hard labor what these guys are doing. And a lot of people make fun of the old Marbleheaders drinking too much in the 1600s. There was no Tylenol, and these guys are always getting hurt. And there's nothing else to drink to begin with. So everybody was drinking, but alcohol is the only way to dull the pain of the inevitable injuries that these guys were sustaining. So they would be stuck at home then for parts of their time if they damaged limbs. And it's a very, very hard life. But it was a lucrative prospect, especially as the 1700s went on. So that by 1765, Marblehead had 5,000 people, 1,000 families, almost 950 families. And there's a painting of Marblehead, a watercolor by Ashley Bowen, in a diary, in a set of journals that he kept, which he illustrated, and they're awesome. Most of you probably know about them, but he illustrated lots of vessels and wrote down a ton about what was happening at town meeting and his various children and grandchildren and various wives as they lived and died and remarried and so forth. And especially what's going on at town meeting. He talked a lot about that. But one of the best things is this image of this townscape that he painted in watercolor in 1763. And if you can see, I guess, let's go back. If you can see three steeples there, one of the churches had just gotten a steeple, a new steeple. If you go to the left, that's St. Michael's Church. It had its steeple starting in 1714. In the middle is the second congregational church, the new meeting house, the new congregational church built right behind the townhouse, just up the hill on what's now Mugford Street, where the Unitarian Church now is. That congregation by 1820 turned Unitarian. But they built a meeting house in 15, 16. Samuel Goodwin, that housewright, came to town to build it. We'll talk more about that next week. We'll touch on it. And they got a steeple. I think their steeple went in 1723, but I'm not positive. And I think Old North, which is over to the far right, Old North was located at where the Franklin Street Fire Station is, across from the Franklin Street Fire Station was, where the Mary Alley Hospital went, that plot of land. They got their steeple in the 1760s, 63 or 64. And I bet that's why, clearly 63, it was there. And I bet that's why Ashley Bowen drew that watercolor. So 1765 is the end of a war called the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War, but in North America, it was a 9-year war, and it was the French against the English. And both of them had Native Americans allied with themselves fighting. Talk more about that in a minute. So I mentioned earlier, generally the town developed from the little harbor that I pointed out at the beginning, but for some of you who came in late, you can see the little harbor off to the far right where the boat crane is, way up in the distance. It developed down the big harbor even while there were sporadic houses here and there, but I'm talking about the major development really started in the 1700s, 17 teens, especially after 1713, and filled in this entire precinct 1 in short order within 2 generations. So another quote from 1750 is, "The whole town is built upon a rock, which is high and steep to the water, very craggy and crazy." I didn't know that was a period term. "From this high cliffy shore, it took its name." I love that quote. So there's a view of Marblehead in 1839, but it gives you a sense of the density around the harbor as it developed down the harbor, along the harbor front of the big harbor now, and not just the little harbor. In 1766, John Adams passed through town and said that Marblehead differs from Salem. The streets are narrow and rugged and dirty, but there are some very grand buildings. And boy, were there some grand buildings. And as I mentioned to begin with, Jeremiah Lee Mansion is one of the finest in all of America from just before the Revolution. And he basically, it looks like, was doing a little bit of rivalry to outdo his brother-in-law, Robert King Hooper, whose house is right below the Jeremiah Lee Mansion in this image. But there were a few other 3-story houses as well, especially after Lee's was built in 1768, 1769. You start to see others. Lee's house was built in 1765. The house wasn't built then. The cellar was dug. The frame was put up in 1766. The cellar was dug in 65. The interiors, the paneling, the finish, the staircases, and all that went in 1767, and we know that documentary, based on documentary evidence, and then it was probably finished by 68. But a lot of the other merchants are scrambling to also build 3-story houses or add a 3rd story to their house. Azer Orn looks like his house was built in 1762 as a 3-story house, but I'm not positive about that. So these were the 2 merchants. You can sense a little rivalry. Again, you could do a whole class on their decorative arts and interiors and furnishing rivalry and their house rivalry. I've touched on that a little bit for the Marblehead Arts Association and for the museum in presentations, but it's pretty fun to see that. But there were quite a few other nice ones as well. One at the top is on Franklin Street. That has all the bells, at the top left has all the bells and whistles you would want to have. It's got this segmental arch over the doorway and the faux corner blocks on the sides. Otherwise, it's a very typical, nice, comfortable Georgian house, but it has the extra details. That's from 1764. The one on the right is from 1721. So the Georgian style persisted for several generations here. Down below in the lower right, that house started as a 1-room house, was expanded to a large, lower left, was it started as a 1-room house, expanded, and those dormer windows are original, as are the ones up on the top right. Down below is another house with all the bells and whistles, just like the upper one diagonal to it. One has a rounded arch, one has a triangle. And if you look at the dormer windows of the upper right house, it's got both. That would have been very high style. And if you look at Versailles, it has both. It just has about 100 dormer windows, but they have those alternating arch, triangle, arch, triangle. Down below, though, this is the Deacon Dolliver house in the yellow house with all of this beautiful, beautiful Georgian detailing. Those dormer windows were probably added in the 20th century. Don't know for sure, but it looks like they might have been, or else they just took the pedimented roofs off. You don't know till you start digging walls apart to find things. And it has a slate roof, but nobody had a slate roof in the 1700s. The slate came in later in the 1800s, 1830s, 40s, 50s. So it has a slate roof now, but none of these houses would have then. They would have been wooden shingles. Philip Chadwick Foster Smith called Marblehead one of the most boisterous, the most boisterous town in 18th century America. So among those beautiful buildings, there was also this undercurrent of, say you had 40 or 60 wealthy merchants and 950 families. It was a rowdy town. And gentlemen could be just as rowdy as ordinary folks, but this might have been a little bit more similar to what you would have seen in a Marblehead tavern, the earthiness of many of the people who lived here, among the genteel, sometimes living right next door. So again, we're talking in the 1700s here, but you would have seen this type in the 1600s as well. And again, it's not limited to the working class or the middle class or the laborers or the tradesmen. It's the gentlemen too. And when they are out of sight of their wives and ministers, they're going to cut loose. This is a scene in Jamaica. So they've got a lot going on there. So taverns could be rowdy places as well, and seaports more so than other places. Toward the end of the evening, maybe people are getting a little calmer, quieted down, zonking out. So this gives you kind of a sense of the two different, the wealthier people and the not so wealthy people. But the seaport harbor front would have had lots of warehouses. There are a lot of warehouses, in fact, in town that became houses later on. Tucker's Wharf, or Pedrick's Salt House, is an example of one of the warehouses that would have been on the water. And this sail off, this image from Bob Booth, it gives you a sense of what the wharfs would have looked like, especially in the 1800s, once the wharfs were stone. Stone started to be quarried in the 1830s. Before then, it would have been wooden wharfs sticking out into the water. Filled with warehouses. There's a little bit of a wharf off of back that up a little bit. I mentioned Pedrick's warehouse on Tucker's Wharf. That building was moved to Salem onto a wharf site. Again, it gives you a really great example of what a warehouse looked like on a harbor front. To the left, lower left, you see an image of Newburyport with warehouses and wharfs and ships pulling in. There would have been barrels all over the shoreline on the wharfs, sending off onto those schooners and on an occasional brig here and there, but mostly schooners. And here's J.O.J. Frost's version of the wharfs in Marblehead, with the schooners pulled up next to them. And I've circled a warehouse that was one of the major warehouses in town, with a very high roof. There were also rum distilleries. I think Bob Booth has found about 6 or maybe 8 rum distilleries. And that might have been a rum distillery for a while as well. On the Boston Yacht Club, you can see over to the right, it was the Ship's Cabin Hotel, a residence hotel, which in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which meant that people would stay overnight there and would not just stay overnight there, they would stay there for the summer, for weeks or a month or two. So it was a residence hotel and it had communal dining. That was built in that principal cove where wharfs would have been in the 1700s, but that cove was later filled in. So that's where the Boston Yacht Club and its parking lot are. That's a picture of the warehouse itself, the big one down there in the corner, in the middle of all that, that would have been on the shoreline, but then the shoreline was filled in. So again, there's Pedrick's Salt House, Pedrick's Warehouse. They probably were multi-purpose. There it is in Salem, giving you a sense of the size with the frigates. The schooners are, of course, much smaller. And there's coastal flooding happening just a couple of years ago. So we're all experiencing that a little bit more here on the coastline. But you can see how the building weathered when it was built, 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago or 10 years ago. And now it's weathered to a nice dark brown, like you would have seen most of the town in the past. And there's the Pedrick Warehouse without its roof, when it was a dance floor for the New Fountain Inn Hotel. So the streets, the streets bleak to the easterly winds, not very compactly built, as Albany, not as neat, all of wood. I mentioned the brick. And the street's very uneven, narrow, and irregular. It contains about 5,000 inhabitants. And the roads are excessive stony and the land very rocky. So people were commenting on this unusual nature of this town. But there would have been loads of families without fathers living in most of these houses. The fathers would have been at sea, the older brothers are at sea, many of them are lost at sea, and many of the houses were quite run down. And these are images of what families might have looked like in the past. Suffering loss countless times, and the women suffering loss as well, as they lost many, many, many children. Many women were pregnant about every 2 years. So Marblehead walking around town would have been pregnant women pretty much everywhere you looked, which is an interesting concept. Maybe half the women might have been pregnant at any given time, and many fatherless children for many centuries, whether it was from the sea or from the revolution. These are just some of the images of what the kind of people they would have looked like and the rigors that they were facing out at sea. The fish went down to the Caribbean in schooners for the most part. There's an image of the neck before it was developed, but it's a really good image of schooners as well. That's a fireboard that's in the Marblehead Museum collection. This is a fireboard of schooners out on the Grand Bank. Commissioned for a fireboard. It's in the Peabody Essex Museum, commissioned by one of the captains who did survive the Great Gale of 1846. And here's a model of one of the schooners. Much of Marblehead's wealth, and we don't have time to go into that today, is based on the enslaved workforce in the Caribbean. Probably 80% of it, maybe 70% of it, about 30% of it went to Spain. That's a rough estimate. It's not really based on anything. It's just based on kind of numbers of ships that are going. And you can see all the ships that would have been coming and going with all kinds of supplies. So all of the colonies are supplying the enslaved labor populations up and down the seaboard, or up and down the coast rather, and down to the Caribbean. The all important sugar for every wealthy person's lifestyle was a very taxing prospect for the Blacks, the enslaved Black Africans and Native Americans, all for sugar and punch. So the best fish, the best cured fish went to Spain. The fish that did not cure well went down to the Caribbean. It was protein, but it probably wasn't very pleasant. This is all dried fish. And the triangle trade, of course, goes up to England and then back to England. Fish to Spain or Malaga or wherever, getting the luxury goods to go up to England and then back to Marblehead. So that triangle trade doesn't have to be an enslaved cargo, but that's what it's come to mean. So I'm going to gloss over these wars and just kind of give you some visuals that we were always at war through the 1600s and through the 1700s, about every 10 years. These are the monarchs that were involved. These are the areas, the regions that were involved, and it always involves the sea where Marblehead is fishing. So it was a very challenging time. But finally, in 1713, that was a treaty, and that was the Queen. In 1713, Queen Anne died in 1714, but the year before she died, a big treaty opened up the Great Bank of Newfoundland to Marblehead fishing. And that's why our economy exploded in 1713 and our building exploded in 1713. Then there are other wars, 1740s, 1750s. Jeremiah Lee was a colonel, Major, and then Colonel Jacob Fowle. The townhouse was built in 1755. This is another part of the built environment that I wanted to cover in architecture because of one of those wars with England and France. That was a global war, really. It was the 7 Years' War in England. It was the 9 Years' War here, French and Indian, but it was a global war, and it always impacted our building practices. We have very little building during those decades of war, and then there's an upspurt again. It's not surprising, but so much of where we fished was impacted by the wars of England and France, and therefore Marblehead's economy did. Because this is going to be recorded, that's why I went and put all of this extra material on it. Any of you who want to go back and see it, you can get a little bit of a better idea. So I'm glossing over it now, but it's there if you want it later on. You can study the maps and see, again, just keeping in mind how it impacted the built environment. And this is the little bit of background in Europe. And that 7 Years' War in Europe really eventually led to World War I. So lots of unresolved issues lead to future wars. There's also one in the 1740s, though, that didn't quite get resolved well enough, and that's why that big global war happened in the 1750s. But the 1740s one impacted Marblehead with the fort that was enlarged. It was not built in 1742, like our sign said, for years and years. It was built in 1644. But some of you know the story of Agnes Surridge, and that's a picture of the Fountain Inn that existed up below Fountain Park. And that's the story of Marblehead Cinderella. And I went into that on the fort talk. If you see that on YouTube, you can get a little of that. But the fort was not even called Fort Sewell until 1800, named after Chief Justice Samuel Sewell. So what we're seeing here in that view are pretty much construction from the 1790s. The fort was extended into this parade ground area with embankments during the Revolution, but those buildings, that white building that you see, was not built until the 1790s. And that renovation ended about 1800, which was when Chief Justice Samuel Sewell was appointed Supreme Court Justice in Massachusetts. And then he was appointed Chief Justice in 1814, the year he died. There were military engineers involved in the Marblehead Fort. There's the plan on the upper right for 1705 for the Marblehead Fort. You're looking at it from coming in toward the mouth of the harbor. And then a plan was drawn in the 1740s by the same guy who did the one on the left. But we think that probably burned in a fire in the State House. The old State House archives burned in 1748. So we don't have that for Fort Sewell, unfortunately. But that's the Agnes Surridge time period. But then there was also, after that global 1750s war, you had Concord and Lexington, which led to the Revolution. And we know that story. So this is kind of taking you through all of these, everything that everybody was building and living in houses against the backdrop of all of the epidemics and the diseases and the accidents and people breaking bones and losing children, to death, all kinds of different diseases. So that's kind of what this page talks about if you go back to it. So these houses were stage sets where life happened just like today. They're not just artistic elements. We live in them, they lived in them, and they made them livable. So lots of change happened over time. So Marblehead's the 10th largest town in British North America, which I think if anybody has a takeaway, that's the main takeaway. We had almost 5,000 people, 4,954, right before the Revolution. We were the second largest, most populous in Massachusetts. Salem was fourth, and Dartmouth down near New Bedford was third. Dartmouth broke into 5 different towns then. So 935 families were living in 519 houses. So a pretty crowded town, assuming some are single family homes, crammed into that 1/4 square mile of Precinct 1. Love this little map. And we know that because of this census that was taken in 1765. And again, a lot of these charts are for you to look at later on, but this is how we know those numbers. There's Marblehead, there's Salem. Boston was 15,320 people. Essex County had 43,707. This is what Boston looked like in the 1760s compared to Marblehead with that population of 15,000. Philadelphia had 20, New York City had 18. Charleston and South Carolina and Newport, Rhode Island were pretty much tied at 11,000. That's Charleston. That's Boston again, excuse me. And New England's most populous towns were Boston, Newport, and then 3 Connecticut towns, not on the river. Should have taken that out, and Marblehead. So Marblehead is right underneath 3 towns in Connecticut. There's Newport, there's the picture of Newport compared to Boston. And the 3 Connecticut towns were Middletown, Norwich, and New Haven. So there are the numbers you can look at later, and there's a map that shows you where those towns were. So I took the word river off of that slide, but not the other one. So just going back again to the maps to orient you. These are where the other more populous towns were. Below Marblehead was Portsmouth, Salem, Dartmouth, Albany. Those were all about 4,000, 4,500 people. Norfolk, Virginia, Annapolis, Maryland. That gives you some context. this is a little bit of what happened to Newport and Charleston, where their population of 11,000 both fell to half pretty much due to British occupations during the Revolution. Boston was occupied for about 6 years, 7 years, 9 months during the war, but the occupation started in 1768. So that took a toll on those towns. That didn't happen in Marblehead. We had no fires. Dartmouth had a British raid. Much of the town was burned. Falmouth, Maine was burned. That didn't happen to Marblehead. And there's Charlestown. And some of you who know Leslie's Retreat might enjoy reading a little bit of that later on if you wanted. It's a little snapshot of the history of Charlestown and what happened and how that impacted the enslaved Black population as well. This is Black History Month. All year should be, is of course of concern, and we're all realizing that now. And this addresses, this slide addresses some of that if you want to go back to that. But there's Ashley Bowen's diary again. I talked about the steeples already. And so now we're going back to the numbers. Cambridge, I wanted to just do a little quick comparison here. Cambridge and Marblehead, Cambridge and Concord and Lexington, 230, 240, 126 families. Salem and Marblehead, 519. So we're very dense, especially compared to the houses. Most people lived in one house. Most families lived in one house in these other towns, not so much these seaport towns. So there's Boston, a map of Boston in the North End. You can investigate the difference between the girls and the boys and the men and the women, the French Canadians, the French neutrals who were relocated to lots of towns in Essex County, but not Marblehead. There were Native Americans living in a couple of towns, none in Marblehead, not in many towns, but in some. So again, you can go back and see these. You can just stop your computer when you watch them and look at these. Then they also, in this big census in 1765, after that 9-year war, they tallied up the Black population as well. There were 3,200 Blacks in Massachusetts, 88,000 total people, 173 Black persons in Salem, twice as many in Salem as in Marblehead. There were only 100 in Marblehead. So that's pretty interesting. And more Blacks in New York than in New England. These are more population figures for those of you who are interested, but the big takeaway is that Marblehead was still the 10th most populous in the United States in 1790, which is really surprising. Partly because a lot of people in Connecticut left and went up to Canada, because when the French Canadians were relocated, there was a lot of open space and available living space. So a lot of folks in Connecticut went up there, and some in Massachusetts. And of course, during the Revolution, more people went up there. So there are a lot of statistics here you can look at. There are 690 houses in 1790, 600 more people, 170 more houses. So that's probably 100 more families. Salem, though, of course, leaped with its economic boom in the Pacific Asian trade. And there are figures there. Salem had 2,400 more people in 1790. Marblehead only had 700 more. So a lot of towns grow in different ways. There's Marblehead in 1795, still the same footprint and the road to the Salem Harbor. We did not recover for another 30 years, really, after the Revolution. And that's I touched on that topic, but these numbers will bear that out, and a little bit of what was happening in the Western towns, Maine becoming a state in the Missouri Compromise in 1820 and so forth. So again, we're kind of floundering through all of this and finally start to recover in the 1830s. We had fewer people in 1800 than we did in 1765. But we did grow back again, but it was just that other towns were burgeoning and Marblehead wasn't. So there's more figures in Marblehead for the 1790, 1800, 1810, 1820. We're still just at 5,600, partially because of the War of 1812. There was a lot of loss there, a lot of widows, a lot of children. But in 1830, things really start to change, even though the footprint of Marblehead's town has not changed. And you can see these maps on Mapping Marblehead on the Town of Marblehead's website through the Historical Commission. And there's a portal at the Marblehead Museum also. So it was the women that really drove the recovery in the 1830s. And that story you can read in the Women of Marblehead, which has a lot of information about this transition from fishing to shoemaking, and it was driven a lot by the women. So we are going to have some time for questions, but I'd love to still just blast through some visuals of the architecture, looking at pretty much a 2-hour class, and I'll allow for sure more time for questions next week. But here's that was the meeting house that was on top of Burial Hill, torn down in 1695. There's where the ferry was located, Salem, as we started as part of Salem. And architecture in the 1600s, the most iconic, of course, is the House of the Seven Gables in Salem. We were part of Salem till 1649. There were more surviving houses in Essex, around Essex County, than in Marblehead from the 1600s. But a lot of those were brought back and embellished. So they're really a fabrication. The ones that we see today in Salem and in other places are fabrications that were recreated based on evidence of what they were seeing. But this gives you a sense of the flavor of what was in Boston and what was in Salem and what was in Europe. It's the same kind of building styles. And where the House of the Seven Gables is coming out of, or the Boardman House up in Saugus. Most of them were simpler like these in Salem, steeply pitched roofs, small narrow windows. This wooden sash in the house on the right didn't come in until the pretty much the 17 teens, you started to see it. Before that, there were much smaller windows with diamond-shaped panes. This is the Balch House in Beverly. The part on the right is the older portion. The part on the left is getting to be more of the symmetrical Georgian style of the 1700s. In England, you would have stone houses, or even in Pennsylvania or in the river valleys in the middle colonies. But here we built in wood. I mentioned why, with the heating situation, but the styles were pretty much the same. Steeply pitched roofs, you would see in England in a stone house or a brick house, and here in wood, because that's what our building material was, these steeply pitched roofs. This is in Portsmouth, but those casement windows that opened out instead of lifted up and down. This is the only brick house in New England from the 1600s that has one of these projecting porticos. It's the Spencer Pierce Little House up in Newbury. It was a very fancy portico style of house. Most were wooden, and if they were fancy, they had the bells and whistles, all the projecting sections that I showed you earlier, or just a straight shape, just showed you, or just a straight overhang across. Very ponderous, very heavy construction. They often called it post-medieval. And the typical elements are center chimneys, the steeply pitched roofs, sometimes some ornamental drops, but small window panes not symmetrically placed. And the oldest house in Marblehead is pretty much thought to be this house from 1640, the old Tucker house on Front Street, which doesn't even survive anymore. So it survived into the age of photography and the turn of the century, but it was just kind of up from the town landing, near where the Marblehead lighting, the ship light store is, up from the town landing across the street. I think that's where it was. But it was famous enough to have very fancy postcards with Lily of the Valley around them. And it's gone now, but not everything survives. We have about 300 surviving of those 500 houses that stood in 1765. This was that one that I mentioned. This is a different Tucker house. So not to be confused with that Tucker. Captain Tucker, who lived in this house, was the one I mentioned earlier that brought John Adams to France. And then there was this Thomas Tucker house, that was Tucker's Wharf. And that house was built in 1825. So these newspaper articles from the 1930s by Frank Damon are also pretty informative. But sometimes they rely a little bit on some of the legends and oral history lore that may or may not be correct. You really have to go to the deeds. You really have to look at the structure. You take it all into consideration to get your answers. So the Marblehead settlement is around the little harbor. The fort was built 1644, as I mentioned. This talks a little bit about the islands and who owned them when, mostly Mavericks Island and then Orange Island. And long story, but you can look at this on your own as well. Reese Island, there was just way too much to talk about in 2 hours, but people often ask about the islands. So I put it in because we're dealing with this century, and you can look at that on your own later on as well. This is a list of the houses that have Bob Booth histories and or signs on them. A couple of them are not Bob Booth histories, but these are the houses still standing from the 1600s that we can locate. And I thank Lenore, my friend, who put it all into a spreadsheet and kind of was tracking this. And I thank my husband who put it into a map because I'm kind of technologically inept. But here they are. Here are a lot of them, not all of them. But this is probably one of the more famous ones. This is Black Joe's Tavern from 1691. Not a Bob Booth history, but oral history, probably pretty sound. Its roof line was raised above the windows. It used until the 1990s. It sat right down across the windows, which is typical. But you can see it has a little bit of a slope to the back called a lean-to. A lot of houses did not have a lean-to. Here's a house that's more urban in what's now Hooper Street, crammed in there with all the other houses from 1683. Same shape, basically, but a smaller footprint and a little bit off to the back, but a very good example of the kind of doors that most people would have had, and nice small panes for like the 1715, 17 teens, 20s, 30s, 50s. The window panes that we see now in Marblehead are pretty much all from the 1830s, 40s, when people could finally renovate again. There are no 18th century windows that I know of except in the Lee Mansion. So here is another example, another Marblehead house, very, very basic, 1683 on Franklin Street. And that was an Ambrose Gale house. This is a son of Ambrose Gale, a smaller house, very, very typical of what would have been here. One room over one room with that steeply pitched roof. And there's another one from 1709 with that steep pitch, but they're very impractical. So we got a 20th century shed dormer put on once upon a time, back in probably in the 20s or the 30s or 40s, 1940s, that skewed the first period look of that house. But the house next door still has its steeply pitched roof as well. Those are below Abbott Hall. I mentioned this one earlier, but right behind it, there is another 17th century house that you can see in the image to the left. And this one we talked about earlier, it's in the first period, still that peaked roof, but it's migrating toward Georgian. And it's important because it's that body of houses. But I show it because of the paint job. And this is if you could afford to paint, you would have painted your doors and window sash this rust red color because it was an iron oxide base to the paint, and you would have just let the rest of the boards weather. So that's what most of the houses would have looked like for color, either no paint or where water could potentially get in, you did paint if you could, and it was usually a red color. So a lot of the town would have looked like this. This house from 1686 on Glover Square has a really fancy chimney. We don't know if it's fanciful or fancy. That house used to have a center chimney though, and the house had an entire right side equidistant to that doorway apparently. And it got relocated, kind of moved off because these houses could be basically disassembled. This is one of the older houses, the oldest potentially, but not sure if that date is really sound. It's definitely an early house that was apparently moved from the Neck over to Gregory Street at some point, but it figured in a lot of postcards. And this is another one-room house. So you had all kinds of different configurations in the early years. This is on Merritt Street. And this is the house that I mentioned earlier from 1694 that you really have to look at the physical construction, combine it with the documents, and it had all those remodels. I think the same thing happened out of town near the library on Hewitt Street. This is supposed to be Moses Maverick's farm, town founder. And that peaked roof that wing on the right would have been the original house, if that's the case. On the left is a different roof line that we'll talk about next week called the gambrel, and that would have been added in the 1720s or 30s or 40s. But here's what so many houses would have looked like in that earlier time, that very early time. Just wood, very basic, until they evolved into what we just saw. Very basic interiors, wooden paneling inside, very little insulation, a bed with curtains if you could afford it, ideally. And this is what a lot of Marblehead houses would have looked like all around the little harbor. Those one-room houses, or the better houses like for the Isaac Allerton and Moses Maverick types, perhaps they looked like this. And this one's at Pioneer Village. The one on the right is in Watertown. So this would have been Marblehead in the 1600s. It's not what we have now left from the 1600s, but so I've had to show you other towns. There's the wood when it's new, and as it oxidizes within 10 years, you're going to have a dark brown house with the wood shake roof. But this house on Wadden Court is not very much different than that, those peaked roofs that we were just seeing. It used to be attached to a bigger 1680s house, but that house was torn down in, say, the 1840s or 50s, and this other house built attached to it. That was an Ambrose Gale house also. So it was kind of two houses put together, just like it is now. It's just that the front one is missing. There's a close-up of what the windows would have looked like in the past. We saw that already. And sometimes they might not have had much in the way of windows. The Georgian period got more windows because window glass was more affordable. But ideally, you might have a little pizzazz in the front of an overhang. And that is not about taxes. It's not about Native Americans, defense. It's all about panache. It's just an aesthetic. And so is the overhang on the roof. Those are aesthetic decorations, and these gables, the peaked gables in the front, is just making a fancier house. Sometimes there were small overhangs on the side. This is in Wenham, and there it is in Marblehead. This is our only overhanging house, except for that one behind Lee Street, one behind the house in Lee Street. But this is just like a 4-inch little jetty that sticks out enough to say, I am a little bit in style. And that would have had furniture and rooms that looked a little bit like this. Nicer houses would have had rooms that look a little bit like this. Everything was done in one room, pretty much. All of your living, all of your sleeping, everything was in one room, just a little higher finish. Nicer floors, heavy beams holding those big houses up, bigger windows. There's still the diamond panes all through the 1600s. This is your house structure with the rafters and the girts and the plates. And there are a lot of different terms that you can throw around, but I chose not to really go into that. That level of technical detail. You can certainly get that online, but that gives you an example, a good sense of how these house structures looked by the time they were in the early 1700s with square windows, vertical windows. There's your rafters and your purlins inside those steeply pitched roofs, and the locking joints for those massive, massive timbers, mortise and tenon joints with a mortise fitting into a tenon pocket. And often they were whitewashed so that you could see inside those dark houses. If you possibly could slather them with the walls with a lime wash, you would do that pretty much once a year after the winter time with so many fires and so much cooking. Your walls would be very dark. So whitewash really helped. Now, of course, it's paint, but that's what the locking joints look like inside a Marblehead house. A little bit of decoration, but pretty basic. They do the job, and they notch them out and slim them down so you have more room in your house. But these houses are very dark, no getting away from that. And the whitewash helped quite a bit. Plaster was often just bare plaster, as you can see in the wall of this house. This is down in Plymouth. And again, there's the chamber pot under the bed and all your living materials that you need. And sometimes the wealthier houses could be pretty fancy with some basic joined furniture, which were built with mortise and tenon joints as well, just like the houses were. These two chests were made in Marblehead. They're owned by the Peabody Essex Museum and by a private collector. This is the heavy kind of furniture you would have. Those chests were made by the same Marbleheader who crafted the pew panels for the Marblehead Meeting House, John Norman, in 1638 to 48, either father or son or both, put the seats into the pew boxes into the meeting house and the seats. And that's kind of what the interior of Meeting House looked like. And 4 of those panels are in the Marblehead Museum collection. A couple are in a set, a whole kind of pew set, prefabricated or refabricated, is in the Old North Church, with a decorative gallery added for the new church in the 1695. This is the new church that was built down below the Burial Hill, where the Mary Alley Hospital was later, and those are the pew boxes that were in it. It would have had this configuration as well, and there it is with its steeple. So sometimes those chests were decorated quite fancy, depended on how much cost you wanted to spend and how skilled your craftsman was. The colors, as I mentioned, there's what those chests would have looked like before they were oxidized. When they were fresh and new, they would have been very vibrant. And these are some colors that actually survive from a very, very early period, potentially from the 1600s in Salem. And there's a whitewash in the roof, in the ceiling. And yes, polka dots in Saugus and in Portsmouth. So here's a fancier house, and chairs, turned, panel, leather. These are the kinds of chairs you would have had in the later 1600s. Cradles. And I'm going to just get to the end of these, and you can scroll through them online sometime when you can watch the link yourself. But you can see how dynamic the 1600s was, whether it was earthy or not. And these are the 44 families who were in Marblehead in 1649 when it was incorporated as a town. So I'm going to stop here. The rest of this, I'm going to invite you to look at. I'm going to try and get myself back to look at some of the people. The rest of these images are all about people. And I'm just going to go through about 5 more, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. And next week, I will leave a lot more time for questions. I want to get to Moses Maverick. These are what some people would look like in the 1600s. There's some faces, some clothing. Here's Isaac Allerton, as I imagine him, and potentially his son-in-law, Moses Maverick, who is our town founder. And maybe his wife, Remember, looked a little bit like these folks. They were married 20 years. She had 8 or 9 children, died at age 40. That was pretty common in the 1700s, 1800s, whenever. He was 19 when he came here, 24 when he got to Marblehead. They were married, and he died 75 years old, 1786, having possessed much land and really launched Marblehead as a going concern. We would not exist if it weren't for Moses Maverick. So this was Moses Maverick's island that he sold in 1675. It became Richard Reef's island. Then Richard Reef's grandson lost it in a debt to Thomas Gary. And I mentioned the Gary family before, and Thomas Gary, so that's the island. So I want to end with Moses Maverick here and just give him a bit of homage because he deserves it. And he's not recognized much. But this cove used to be called Maverick's Cove, just like that used to be called Dolliver's Cove. But the Dolliver family still kept living in the homestead for a while, into the time when it got onto the sea charts. Maverick's Cove fell away. It never stuck because he had 3 sons who all died unmarried, and the rest were daughters. So his name died with him, and nobody knows that that was Maverick's Cove. So someday I'd love to rename that again, Maverick's Cove, somehow. So we'll see. All right. That was a lot. We'll have more time for questions, but we've got 15 minutes here. Are you there, Lauren? Anyone want to ask a question?
I am here. So far, the questions are to do with watching it again. And yes, as mentioned in the email, I will send out a password protected YouTube video of this and just ask you not to share the password with others, just use it yourselves. This and all of the 4 presentations you'll have access to YouTube. Just give me a few minutes after the fact to upload it.
So I realized I packed a lot in there, and when there's so much, sometimes things get out of order. So I apologize for that. And every time you do something, it gets streamlined. So it was a first run, but I hope you were able to get some sense of what Marblehead was in the 1600s, what it became in the 1760s, and what it was through the 1700s, because it really was a very prosperous community. And I think that's the really surprising thing that I hope that we will all remember, if nothing else from this course.
Judy?
Yeah.
This is Peter Cox. Joan Thayer asked a question in writing earlier in the talk about the, I think it was, was there a functional aspect of the cove, that exterior cove? I think, was it the cove you called it?
Yes.
On the roof line?
That's what it's called. And no, there was no functional aspect to it. Well, I take that back. If you were on a walking tour, and we'll cover this a little bit next week, the houses built in the 17 teens and 20s have a little bit of an overhang on their roofline eave. Those coved cornices are really part of that early 1700s time period, but they're considered first period. So I put them in, and this is where I was talking about what's significant. This class was where I was talking about what's significant about Marblehead architecture. And that is one of the significant things, that we have one of those houses in town. So all of that overhang might have been for rain, so that the rain would drop and not trickle down. There were no gutters for the most part. Rain would not trickle down your wooden clapboard walls. But the panache of the cove was purely decorative. And then that entire overhang really recedes by 1730 and 40. So we'll go into that next week.
Judy, Roger Tuvison. Roger Tuvison, question.
Hi, Roger.
How you doing?
And hi, Peter.
The very last picture you have here says Moses Maverick died in 1786. I think you mean 1686.
Oh, I certainly do. Sorry about that. When he was 75. Yes. Thank you.
Judy, we have a question in the chat. Could I share with you, please?
Yes.
David asks, where would Isaac Allerton have lived? Do we know where Moses and Remember Allerton lived after Isaac left his property, boats, and fishing flakes to them?
That's been a big mystery, pretty much. And nobody has really explored the deeds to find that out. As you know, Lauren, we got a call from somebody, or an email from somebody on the South Shore who's been researching Mayflower descendants and original Mayflower, the homes of original Mayflower passengers, Isaac Allerton being one of them. So he's actually looked into it pretty in depth, and I do not know, and I have not looked into it, so I turned him on to Bob Booth. I'm hoping they're going to come up with something. But from what that gentleman was able to determine from the research that he did, was that Moses Maverick's homestead area was pretty much in the parking lot of the boatyard at Dokes Lane, where this cove, just like the Dolliver's house, the Deacon Dolliver house is at the head of Dolliver's Cove, Maverick's Cove was kind of his area. He owned the island. He operated in the cove. He had his wharfs where the dock is right now, I mean, where the boatyard is now. This was kind of a tidal zone, but wharfs would have extended into the water. So that makes so much sense. And that seems to be where it was. Now, I mentioned his farm, which is supposed to be out at Hewitt Street. And if the resident of that street has not hired Bob Booth to do the history, or if nobody else has researched it, we don't know. So there is a lot more information that needs to be gleaned. I have a list of about the top 10 houses that are the most important. I also have a list of the top 10 houses that really need house histories being researched. One is the Gary house. One is Maverick's farmhouse. And one is his original house. Now, Isaac Allerton doesn't seem to have had a house. He wasn't here for very long. He probably lived with Moses and Remember. A lot of families lived together with their sons and sons-in-law. But there was a house owned by a guy named Matthew Craddock. And if you look at Ginny Gamage's book or at Samuel Rhodes's book, Spirit of 76 Lives Here or Marblehead History and Traditions, they both talk about Matthew Craddock. He's the investor in England who was sort of the manager of this plantation. The stock companies were just that. The plantations were funded by stock companies, which were just that. There were lots of people that bought into it, but they had to have a manager. And Matthew Craddock was the manager for this area and maybe others. He never came to Marblehead, but he had a house here. He owned a house here. And Isaac Allerton was apparently staying in that house or living in it. We don't know. And because he and a bunch of guys were smoking their pipes. And at some point, those fireplaces were not, a lot of those chimneys were not brick chimneys yet. And so there was a fire that caught in the thatch. And in fact, thatch was outlawed in 1634 because it was so flammable. And you had to use wood shingles. But at any rate, a tailor saw the fire. They got out of the house, but the house burned. And the house was thought to be right at the base of Burial Hill. And if you go up the walkway to Burial Hill from Orange Street and start to go up, off to your left, there are a couple of houses. That's the zone that they think that the Matthew Craddock house was. But he never was here. And then it burned down. And then Allerton was warned out of town and he went to New Haven and died there. And don't forget, New Haven and New York were Dutch at this time, up until 1664. So I really want to thank you. I'm happy to take another question, but I really want to thank you all for sitting through this. This is the maiden voyage for this presentation. And I can see where it can be streamlined. And sometimes I duplicated to make a point and go back to it. So you all were very good to kind of go through that. Walking tours are hard because you can't have a progression. And I think I wanted to jump ahead to Marblehead in its heyday, which was the 1750s and 60s, and then kind of, take us to 1713, then we leaped to the 60s. Next time, I think I'll do the progression of those years and not put quite so many quotes about the Rocky Harbor. But I love those quotes because they put a face on the community of its topography. And then the portraits and people and paintings put a face on the people. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, you have a question, Judy. How long have you been in town?
27 years, quarter of a century. I'm new. It's ironically, I do this. I'm a social historian, etc. I live in the past mentally. I'm a first generation American and on one side and a second generation on the other. So it's interesting that I feel pretty steeped in this. And I did come directly to Marblehead, as I said, because of the architecture from Los Angeles, from a art museum career there. And I came to the MFA, but lived in Marblehead when I was working at the MFA and wanted to be here. And Betty was retiring right at that time. And I was fortunate to get the job and was there for the Historical Society's first year-round staff person. There is so much to this town's history that's so dynamic. Every place has interesting history, but this town really has a very dynamic history. And the past was far more dynamic than most of us realize. That's why I want to throw so much social history in all the time. And it does bog it down and get confusing. I'll be more streamlined with the rest of the class because we'll be talking more about architecture. But this, I really wanted to set the stage for Marblehead.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all. And we will see you next Wednesday morning at 10.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Take care.
Stay warm, stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you.